Good afternoon, buonasera, benvenuti e benvenute a tutti e tutte. My name is Ellen Nierenberg, and I am the current president of the American Association for Italian Studies. Thank you for coming this afternoon to the presentation by Professor Sandra Ponzanesi of Utrecht University. Professor Ponzanesi is professor and chair of media, gender, and postcolonial studies at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies and the Graduate Gender Program. Sandra Ponzanesi's scholarly production and inquiry roots in concerns of gender and postcolonial critique within interdisciplinary and comparative parameters. Her research centers on postcolonial studies, transnational feminist theories, comparative literature, Italian colonial history, European migration studies, visual culture, postcolonial cinema, and media and conflict studies. In an effort to give you some scope of the capacious contours of her scholarly production, I'd like to mention several titles from her expansive research oeuvre. Even limiting myself, as I do, to the last decade, the list seems voluminous. Perhaps unusually, I'm going to start by mentioning an essay from 2016 published in Transnational Cinemas and with the title of Shipwrecks and Weddings, Borders and Mobilities in Europe. This essay proposes a new visual politics of Europe's borders that foregrounds encounters and trespassings. Here, our colleague takes as her subject several films that predicate on the migrant drama, but in particular on two films that received wide international acclaim. Io sto con la sposa from 2014 and Fuoco a mare from 2016. Both films take up concerns of migration as a humanitarian crisis, but neither is a simple act of denunciation. Neither film announces itself as a straightforward documentary, but instead they offer innovative visual registers that defy categorization or fixed genres, such as the road movie or observational documentary. Io sto con la sposa uses the format of a traveling wedding party that disregards both legislation restricting free mobility in Europe and the cynicism of the hopelessness of the migrant condition. The reason I begin with this essay is because in 2020 in Tucson, Arizona, on the occasion of that convening of the AAIS, Professor Ponzanesi was to have been the author of our keynote address. The association had arranged for a screening of Io sto con la sposa, a film that asks us to consider not only a Mediterranean or maritime migration, but also an overland odyssey. In addition, we had arranged a conversation with the filmmakers Antonio Augugliaro, Gabriele Del Grande, and Khaled Soliman Al-Nasiri. In choosing this film and our speaker, the association had hoped to draw critical attention, critical here meant in its finest and most constructive sense, to our conference emplacement in Arizona, itself no stranger to the moment of overland border crossings. As a gesture toward sketching some of the flows of Professor Ponzanesi's research interest, let me now mention some of the titles that I had promised. From 2014, the essay entitled Queering European Sexuality Through Italy's Fascist Past, Colonialism, Homosexuality, and Masculinities in What's Queer About Europe? Productive Encounters and Re-Enchanting Paradigms. From 2015, the Postcolonial Cultural Industry, From Consumption to Distinction in the journal Frame. From 2017, Connecting Shores, Libya's Colonial Ghost and Europe's Migrant Crisis in Colonial and Postcolonial Cinematic Representations in the anthology Border Lampedusa, Subjectivity, Visibility, and Memory in Stories of Sea and Land. From 2018, the introduction, co-authored with A.J. Habed, entitled Postcolonial Intellectuals, European Publics, in the anthology she co-edited with H. Adriano and with the title Postcolonial Intellectuals in Europe, Critics, Artists, Movements, and Their Publics. Casting back to 2012, I would like to conclude this overly simplified listing of our colleagues' scholarship with special reference to the introduction that Professor Ponzanesi co-wrote with Marguerite Waller, entitled Postcolonial Cinemas, Unframing History, in the important volume that she edited with our dear colleague, Margie Waller, Postcolonial Cinema Studies, published by Routledge. There's much scholarship to account for, but I'm going to limit my review to those. Professor Ponzanesi holds a laurea in English from the University of Bologna, and consequently, speaking at this year's AAIS is a kind of homecoming for her. In addition, she holds a master's from the University of Sussex and a doctorate in comparative literature and gender studies from Utrecht University. Professor Ponzanesi's address that wasn't in 2020 enjoyed support from the association's two caucuses, the Women's Studies Caucus and the Queer Studies Caucus. Her presentation this evening continues to have the benefit of vital support from those two caucuses, as well as the association's newest caucus, ratified last year, the Critical Race, Diaspora, and Migrations Caucus. I'd like to remind all of you that this is the first of two keynote activities. Our second keynote activity will be tomorrow afternoon at the same time. Dennis Looney will speak with the title of his presentation, Dante, From the Deep South to the Global South. After her presentation, there'll be discussion. Professor Ponzanesi will recognize you from the dais. And after that, you are invited to an aperitivo. Just seguite l'onda as we go to Santa Cristina. It is 8 minutes walk from here, and no one will get lost, I do promise you. The title of Professor Ponzanesi's remarks this afternoon the title is Migrant Figurations, New Questions for Italian Postcolonial Studies. Please join me in welcoming her to the AAIS 2022.
Welcome, everyone. Is it on? Thank you, Helen, for this wonderful introduction. I think I've been zigzagging a lot of different productions that I've forgotten myself. So it's quite impressive that you managed to recap them in a kind of non-traditional way. So it's a great pleasure for me to give this keynote, and I feel like an imposter because I'm not a traditional Italianist, and I'll explain you in a minute why. But this IIS here in Bologna is very special to me because, as many of you may be, but I graduated here 30 years ago, so this is really my alma mater. And I actually lived around the corner in Via dei Poeti, so it's like very kind of strange homecoming in many different ways. And also very daunting. I thought that we'll be in the Aula Magna, and that church was the inauguration of the 900th year of the University of Bologna history, so the oldest university in the world. So I'm very happy that we chose a little bit more modest setting to feel a little bit less daunting and the weight of history on me. I also want to thank you again, Ellen Ehrenberg, for sticking up with me for 2 years. Indeed, we had a different topic in the past, and I've been thinking through this kind of 2 years of lockdown, what will be my contribution today. So bear with me. I will talk about your reference that you made, but I want to also to do a bit of a politics of location, because as I said, I studied here modern languages, and in particular English. Is this on? Yes. English, actually. And from the very beginning, I was trying to get a little bit away from the classical canon and the kind of disciplinary encroachment, the distinction. I was very lucky to have a very non-traditional teacher that actually, from the very beginning, helped me to navigate different spaces. So from the beginning, I actually was thrown into year one, deconstructionism. And what Harold Bloom was then doing with the anxiety of influence was one of the very first texts I was exposed to, which referred to the psychological struggle of aspiring author to overcome the anxiety posed by the influence of their literary predecessors. This is from 1973. Of course, it was exclusive about the legacy of literary writers who were male, white, and Anglo-centric, and the reference here, you can see some of the networks. But I was likely introduced also to new texts that at the time were kind of influential, like The Mad Woman in the Attic by Guber and Gilbert, who opened my mind to the new possibilities of feminist critique, but also how to read the text against the grain, and therefore against the disciplinary boundaries that I was trying to escape somehow, even though I knew English is kind of a word language, but how to avoid the English traditional canon. Yet the issue of colonialism, race, and ethnicity had not made its entrance into my education. So a few years into my studies, I found, of course, the translation of Edward Said Orientalism in the library, and my awakening was complete. That was the beginning of my long career as a postcolonial scholar that started very much here in Bologna, even though back then it was described as Commonwealth Studies, now rejected as a ghetto term. And I work on a thesis on V.S. Naipaul, who's, of course, very contentious Caribbean writer, who is actually not very kind to his postcolonial scholars, who will later receive the Nobel Prize in 2001. So why am I telling you this? What is the relevance of an English studies scholar for the American Association of Italian Studies? This is just to sketch the trajectory of a journey that's been characterized by what I call late Italianists. These are scholars who have, for professional or personal reasons, ended up working and studying outside of Italy, where the contamination with interdisciplinary studies, comparative literature, and intermediate approaches did not seem to create anxieties of disapproval, but actually was supported and encouraged. As part of the new cultural studies development that have flourished, of course, in the UK already in the 70s and the 80s, and was spreading very far, but it was very late in Italy, especially the Dipartimento di Italianistica was very resistant in its kind of purist and traditional mode. So it is no surprise that the interest for emerging studies dealing with migration and postcolonialism in Italy came first from scholars who were working abroad in the first place, in my case in the Netherlands, who were often coming from English studies where the field of postcolonials had already boomed in the 90s and crossed the Atlantic from Edward Said to other departments. I will not go into the many details of the development of postcolonial studies, its potential and contentions, and the various disputes, but it should suffice to say that it was the offspring of that generation of scholars who found their way back into Italian studies via a detour, being a bit what Said had described, how to place and slightly marginal to the field of Italianistica, but being also what Gayatri Spivak has theorized as a native informant, because of that receiving the recognition, authority, and distinction as an Italian scholar because of an accident of origin. So forgive my personal digression, but I think this path is not exemplary, but telling of the development of Italian postcolonial studies, which has really started through the back door, via many scholars formed in the comparative literature department operating within the US academia and Northern European studies. So it is no coincidence that I'm addressing you here in Bologna in English instead of in Italian, expressing many of these complexities, complex itineraries and detour. A detour coming from comparative literature, but in particular postcolonial studies, that provided me with a new lens and to explore Italian culture otherwise, in order to analyze what already in the 19th I described as the Italian postcolonial unconscious, the difficulty of facing, recognizing, and confronting the legacy of the empires, the legacies of empire on the one hand, removed and remote from the national consciousness, but also the rise of a complex multicultural society that from the 80s and 90s onward distinctly influenced and changed through different waves the Italian cultural landscape. This migration were not only coming from the former Italian colonies, Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, or Libya, but also from other formerly colonized European countries from the global south. At the time, I worked on addressing the inherent universalism and hegemony present within the postcolonial discourse itself, which takes the Anglo-Saxon reference as default, making other empires and their legacy, such as the Italian one, becoming doubly marginalized on the international marketplace, which remained dominated by the hegemony of the English language and the major UK-India axis. So the cultural presence of the writing of writers from the Italian colonies will be seen as non-competitive and not easily translatable, making the field of Italian postcolonial studies become one more not only belated, but also minor in comparison to other European ones. So this was a little bit the topic of the first book, the PhD, and you can see that I try to make this connection between the very well-established canon of Indian writers in the diaspora with a nascent tradition of writing in Italian from the former colonies, from the Horn of Africa, which at the time were very difficult to find, if not a kind of churches at very dislocated places. So it was like a very difficult asymmetrical approach to do, how to justify the nascent Italian postcolonial tradition and make it in a comparison with something which was so overwhelmingly furbished and popular. So in order to assess the state of the art of Italian postcolonial studies, it would be useful to define exactly what postcolonialism is and does. In short, to define postcolonialism as a critical tool and not as a catch-all term. Postcolonialism should be understood here not as a chronological transition from a colonial to a postcolonial status, but as a lens, as an intellectual attitude that aims to critically assess the operation of empire and the lasting legacy and effect in present-day society. As such, the postcolonial framework is not very welcome. It is not only very welcome in the Italian arena, but also much needed in order to correct form of amnesia or suspicious project of historical revisionism. So you can see here many of the first texts, and of course they're all women writers because they were much more dominant in the 90s than male. What makes Italian study postcolonial is therefore not so much the technical and chronological relationship with the former colonies, but the awareness and with that the consciousness of former domination and resistance within Italian culture as related to power structure that are connected to both colonial policies and new global dynamics. It is a counter-hegemonic stance that addresses issues of institutionalization, canonization, and governmentality from different subject positions in order to make evidence not only other marginality and subalternity, but a new field of tension of translation, which create new creation. As such, postcolonialism is a never-ending process that requires renewal and critical alertness in order to not to become another dogma or empty tool. So it's very important to see the postcolonial, how it does actually travel to Italy and trying to integrate within the Italian context. So there should be legacies that come from the continent itself and from within Italy. So I've written in the past about now I would like to make some example how this kind of postcolonialism played out both in Italian literature and cinema, to then move to a different field that I've been working on more recently. So I've written in the past about the free wave of Italian migrant literature, first in the 90s as co-authored text between intellectual and journalists and migrant writers, a quattro mani, as we want to say. Then at the beginning of 2000, the first recognized and published author that went beyond the autobiographical and focused on more creative and experimental writing to arrive to the full postcolonial phase with the second generation of postcolonial writers, often of mixed heritage, educated in Italy and therefore proficient in Italian language, not accented and largely embraced by the publishing industry, but now including the mainstream canon and having a very active role in the public debate. So I refer to this as the three phases of Italian migrant/postcolonial literature, as the shock of arrival, the enigma of the encounter, and the exuberance of diversity, which of course have a bit of an bias-naival resonances. These stages are characterized by the uncertain genesis, trouble consolidation, and achieved maturity of Italian migrant literature, respectively, considered within the postcolonial framework and European panorama. The shock of arrival. Few intellectuals and journalists took the lead to approach the life and story of significant or representative representative immigrant, by collaborating with them on narrative text relating the stories of this new migrant from their own perspective, by offering help with linguistic competence and introducing them to the publishing industry. The objective of this intellectual was to create a dialogue between cultures and to engender more tolerance and less panic. It is therefore the era of autobiography, testimonial, diaries, and memoir, often written with four hands. For example, the collaboration with journalist Oreste Pivetta, that you all know, the Senegalese Pape Kouma, published Io venditore di elefanti, I'm an elephant salesman, was one of the first to actually appear on the market. And many other texts on this slide you can see that actually create a new interest in these stories of arrival, but were more sociological and anagraphical than really interested in their literary qualities. Myself, I work more on female writers. I already mentioned Maria Viarengo, the Italo-Ethiopian, Rick Passibatu, who published the Texto a Fronte that you can see here. But also Nasser Akora, who Volevo diventare bianca, and Sirad Hassan, all writers who actually disappeared from the publishing industry. So it's kind of interesting how all this exploit was really very short-term. So if this collaboration between non-native speaker and linguistic expert empower migrant writers, it also seriously undermines their autonomy. There is in fact a remarkable degree of interference between the immigrant's personal experience and the editor's interest in eligible stories of difference. Complex authorship, suggests Alessandro Portelli, also stand for split authorship. The second phase, the enigma of the encounter, signaled the transition from a market-oriented interest in the exotic and representative story of immigration, co-authored and mediated by Italian intellectuals, to more independent attempts to find a voice and a personal literary path. These were often writers in a different country who had to readapt themselves through the Italian language. It is the period in which new special literary magazines are created like Sagarana or El Ghibli, and special literary prizes are established for migrant literature. I'm talking about the Extra Prize, but also many interesting new voices emerging. As you can see here, this is a just brief selection. The period is really overwhelming with upcoming talent. In short, the panorama of the 90s is rather fragmented, the late 90s, but this does not mean that the literature of migration disappeared altogether. On the contrary, it must be said that this period of incubation helped the literature of migration in Italy to mature and the few determined writers to survive and continue experimenting with their own style, content, and technique, often in dispute with the Italian establishment, and making serious inroads into the literary arena. So that's when we go to the full postcolonial phase, the new millennium in which we acknowledge a level of increased confidence, differentiation, and expansion of migrant literature in Italy. This has reconfirmed many of the writers who stayed afloat, like Aidiari, who just got the Premio Montale for poetry, but also the emergence of the wonderful trio, Ijaba Shego, Gabriella Germandi, Uba Cristina Alifara, of course, the new millennium writers, all female, all with connection to the Horn of Africa by via of their parents, but also extremely active on the public space and the public arena as intellectual, trying to mobilize question of diversity, gender, and inclusion through the magazines that already said Ghibli, Negrizia, but actually play an important role in the media landscape. So Ijaba Shego just started with a prize for Salsicce, a short story, and she went on to become one of the most translated Italian authors in other languages. And of course, Ardua was also translated in English, and also someone very prominent also social media. And making the connection also to Afro-American writers, issue of rare racism elsewhere to the Italian specificity and context. I want to briefly focus on Gabriella Germandi because her novel, Regina di Fiori and di Perle, Queen of Flowers and Pearls, Donzelli 2007, was quite unique for its scope and scale, because it returned to the colonial past and narrated the period of Ethiopian resistance to the fascist attack of 1936. Though the topic is serious, her prose is light, at times lyrical, never accusatory or moralistic. Yet she reported in literary terms all that already been confirmed by historians such as Angelo Del Boca about how, when fighting the Ethiopians, the Italians used gas and went against the Geneva Convention and perpetuating inhuman war crimes. Her account of the Ethiopian resistance also included heroic female figures who were not auxiliary to male action, but who managed on the front line, such as the mythical Kebedek Seyum. And this is something we have now read in the recent novel by Masa Mengistu. You know, she's the Ethiopian-American writer who published The Shadow King, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and of course, who just did this wonderful work on Italian-Ethiopian conflict through female eyes, represented the role of female combatants who had been silent by history. And of course, she managed to acquire international visibility 10 years later, much more than Girmandi had managed, though she had paved the way. But just to go back to Girmandi, of course, what is interesting in the novel is the question of intertextuality, because she has direct references to what is the colonial, post-colonial novel par excellence, A Time to Kill by Flaiano. And she picked one of the famous scenes of the female in the washing in the pond, being objectified, sexualized, and silenced with a kind of famous scene of rape. And she reversed the narrative and actually managed in a way to rewrite the kind of history writing. As Gabriele Proio recently pointed out, Gabriela Germandi's rewriting in a post-colonial novel rewrites one of the key scenes of Flaiano's novel, offering the reader the chance to reconsider the Italian conquest of Ethiopia and the important role played by the African resistance. If in Germandi's story the indigenous woman reacts against the violence the soldiers tries to inflict on her and finally kills him, it means that an alternative path of memory is still possible. And here you see a little bit the testo affronte and the dialogue which has been created through history and time and literary devices. There are many wonderful writers who are still very active, but I wanted to have a little bit of a panorama, including cinema as well, because as Ellen has mentioned, it's one of my favorite topics. Even though I'm not in a film studies department, I'm still relishing the wonderful work that I did with Margaret Wallace on post-colonial cinema studies. We could to a certain extent identify the same classification for Italian post-colonial cinema, in which we have an initial phase of sociological interest in story of arrival and victimhood, and we have here very famous film, initial one with Pumarò, Lettere dal Sahara, Io e l'altro, maybe you know, Un'anima divisa in due, Vesna va veloci. There are so many very interesting first films, but they mutate quite quickly into a second phase, the enigma of the encounter for cinema, in which you really see the question of integration and acculturation and diversity becoming front stage. We have films like La Straniera, La Sconosciuta, Princesa, Saimir, Alia Gli Occhi Azzurri, all wonderful films. They are leading to a new phase that I will call of cinema impegnato, with the exuberance of diversity, in which also the mainstream become part of this rethinking of the relationship with the colonial past and the current history of migration. So this third phase have a wonderful suggestion with Andrea Segre, which I'll mention in a bit. Jusoli, Bocovurno, of course, wonderful film. But Ellen already mentioned on the bright side, Io sto con la sposa, which is internationally, which is special for the way in which it came to life, but also for the narrative stories and the way it's been constructed. Made in 2013, is a brave and poignant documentary, a road movie across Europe with a visionary language. No one can stop a bride at the border. The cultural symbolism carried by a bride on her way to a wedding party with guests in tow is a genial idea from journalist and activist Gabriele Del Grande, Palestinian-Syrian poet and writer Khaled Soliman al-Nasiri, and filmmaker Antonio Gugliaro, who turned themselves for the occasion into benign contrabandists. The idea behind the docufilm is connected to a real event, the staging and performing and filming of a fake wedding to smuggle a group of 5 Syrian and Palestinian migrants out of Italy on a trip that will take them to Sweden, considered the European Mecca for refugees. Because of the Dublin Convention, this means breaking the law and endangering all those who participated in the wedding with criminal repercussion. The film combined activism and journalism, resorting to an unprecedented online crowdfunding campaign to get financially off the ground. Focusing on the plight of Syrian and refugee and Palestinian migrants fleeing war-torn Syria, the film puts the spotlight on the issue of migration, but with a positive message. The project, which is an act of protest and civil disobedience against the regulation of Fortress Europe, proposes alternative solution to the stereotypical representation of migrant refugees as victims and as invaders by presenting a model of solidarity and optimism. This is done using the format of a traveling wedding procession that defies both legislation restricting free mobility in Europe and cynicism about the hopelessness of the migrant condition. You see, it was presented in Venice, and it was a beautiful decor, all white dresses, and was a very special Lido moment. In Fuoco a Mare, that you all know, Gianfranco Rosi presented the tragedy of Lampedusa outside of the regular schemes and screens showing that the islanders have a different sense of solidarity to that of the European Union, but stating that fishermen accept everything that comes from the sea. It is a film that combines art with politics of the everyday. It is not a film of political denunciation, but a perspective from the ordinary life of people on the island, mostly through the eyes of a 12-year-old boy, Samuele. Rosi's approach is unobtrusive and observational rather than confrontational, almost in the best neorealist style. There is little intersection between the two worlds portrayed. This was one of the main critiques against Rosi and the film. The two worlds of the distraught and traumatized refugees on the one end, and that of timeless local, shaped by generation of devotion to life on the sea and religious ritual. However, Rosi finds way to intersect some common threads. The harrowing Navy radio that received the distress call for help from sinking migrant vessel finds an echo in the local radio station, where a local DJ plays songs from a bygone era and takes dedication from his most loyal listener, his aunt. The island doctor Pietro Bartolo, whose task is to save the wretch of the earth, is the important connection between the migrants and Samuele. These two films combine a fresh idea of how to conceive the borders between Europe and the rest, based not on policing and surveillance, but on the principle of common humanity. That counters the bombastic rhetoric of media sensationalism and the inhospitable EU Frontex operation established in 2014. A different style was used by the Magui Ymer documentary Asmat, Nomi per tutte le vittime in mare, Names in Memory of All Victims of the Sea, from 2015. The short documentary, which does not follow any filming rule and refuses to adapt to a traditional narrative style, was shot in Lampedusa on the way of the commemoration for the victims of the 3 October 2013, to offer a tribute to those young people, mostly originating from Eritrea and escaping their dictatorial and militarized country. The result is a filmic production that is not easily identifiable, neither as a film nor as a literary poem. It is deliberately filmed in a provocative and unsettling way, offering a long like and digital litany. A female voiceover recalls in a mantra style each one of the victims by name: Selam, peace, Tesfaye, my hope, for a beautiful visualization and the name in Tigrinya characters projected on the waves of the sea, restoring the victim dignity from nameless and group anonymity. The film images give space to this name without borders. The director commented by saying, The Lampedusa tragedy has confronted all of us with a new element. For the first time, the authorities have been able to reconstruct all or almost all the names of the victims. This has never happened before. In Asmat, I wanted to force my spectator to listen to all of them from first to last. I did not limit myself to making a consolatory spot, to be quickly consumed between one film or the other. I wanted to defy the attention and patience of the public in order to bring back the numbers of the tragedy and the reality of names. It takes 10 minutes to read the 368 names of the victims of Lampedusa. Imagine how long it will take to read all the 900 names of the last tragedy. Unfortunately, this time no one can tell with precision who they are. So the documentary makes us count them one by one so that we realize that these names have been separated from the body in only one day in the Mediterranean. So Asmat beautifully captured the issue of representation, embodiment, and memory, how to keep the memory alive and restore the dignity of migrant men nameless by the act of dying. And there is also the question how to represent the unrepresentable, the phantomatic trace that needed to be recovered. Another author, of course, paved the way on issues of migration and multiculturalism is Andrea Segre, who has a very important oeuvre to his name. Sud di Lampedusa, of course, was one of the most successful cinema film, but I would like to briefly introduce here Mare Chiuso, that he made with Stefano Liberti, and in which we are really the genre of political cinema or cinema engagé, in which we also see how the voice is given back to the subaltern, marginalized subjects, the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. It's a very special film because it's actually constructed around this kind of footage the migrant refugee made of themselves, where they were being rescued at the high sea in the Mediterranean by the Italian patrol. And instead of being saved, as the Geneva Convention will have to do, they've been brought back to Libya. So it was a total infringement of the rights of asylum seekers. And they managed to keep this footage, the digital footage, in their mouth, and through the Libyan prison and encampment to connect to Andrea Segre and reach the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights. So this footage is a rare cameo that provides evidence to incriminate Italy into unlawful practices of pushback operation. It's a kind of citizen media, people becoming, through little acts, citizens in their own right and find a way to combine artistic denunciation with social activism to bring really concrete change. Italy was sued, and the film's success is the reversing the mainstream narrative and giving credence to the migrant perspective and the migrant's own skill at preserving the short clip that they recorded testify to the empowering potential of digital tools, now widely available and highly adaptable. Without suggesting they're simply a democratizing tool, it is fair to say that the digital media have enlarged the space of participation and protest the migrants and other constituencies can now use. So this is a more recent films that I will not have the time to discuss, but I wanted to make this connection between the digital participation and how migrants are actually using digital media in order to find new forms of participation and activism. I'm drawing here from the ERC project Connecting Europe, in which we studied the digital practices of migrant women from 3 different countries, Somalia, Turkey, and Romania, living in 3 of Europe's main cosmopolitan hubs, Rome, Amsterdam, and London. It was a rather large ethnographic work that combined digital methods with interview and participant observation. The scope here was to explore the way in which digital media are not just abstract technologies, but come to life through the user, who from the bottom-up engagement become producer, participant, and media makers, shaping not only the content of their representation and creating counter-publics, but also allowing them to forge new alliances and digital diaspora across borders and boundaries. So this digital media allowed to create new form of co-presence, which radically changed the ways in which physical distance is bridged through digital proximity, thereby substantially changing the way in which migration is managed but also experienced. So we have, in a way, diasporic digital culture allowed to move from shared vulnerability to bonds of solidarity. And this was allowed to move beyond the national focus, studying migration across boundary and through transnational networks that foster intimacy and belonging. So diaspora remains a concept born out of an initial displacement that occupied an instant role in the individual and collective memories of migrant people. Both the working of power, the bonds born out of shared vulnerability take place in the spectrum between digital coding, material infrastructure, and practices of the everyday. So instead of reifying the digital in the digital diaspora, we prefer to mark a more ethnographic approach that focuses on how the internet mediates everyday life and is part of domesticating technology for the purpose of transnational family relations, digital intimacies, and co-presence. So while we account for the different layers that the notion of digital diaspora entail, internet-specific, network-oriented, and embedded in wider social practices, we foregrounded the idea of digital diaspora conveyed through its everydayness. This relates to establishing points of connection and support based not on national or ethnic bonds, but on conviviality, mutuality, and support within and across diaspora. The notion of the everyday emphasizes the concept of diaspora not as an ethno-bubble or contested political identification, but as a place of belonging and comfort, a way of placemaking that cuts across inward-looking encapsulation versus outward-looking cosmopolitanization. So this focus on the everydayness is also meant to overcome the inherent bias of digital diaspora with the risk of glossing over the intersecting gender, racial, class, generation, and geopolitical power relations. So the focus on digital practice and the everyday allow us to tap into the politics of emotion and the affective dimension of migration and belonging. Rather than focus on the abstract capability of the medium, specify the hubs, platform, and devices, the ethnographic approach allows us to tap into the understanding of digital diaspora as part of everyday practices, by situating them in particular context and revealing a socially diverse practice of different ethnic groups and generations. So I'm coming to the close, because for migrant women we have met in a project, the use of digital media is strongly embedded in the gender role as mother, daughter, students, expat, reunited wife, who keep the ties both with the homeland and with the other diaspora community through specific digital strategies and tactics in ways that were deemed revealing and insightful for understanding the paradigm of digital diaspora from the bottom up. So I wanted to mention this new line of research, which allows us to tap into the life, knowledges, and practices of migrants more directly than through the representational work of writers, filmmakers, and spaces allowed by the cultural industry. Though there are many uplifting examples, as many interventions in this conference have actually shown, we have the beautiful work of Covorno, but also recent series that occurs and making us hopeful about the diversity and inclusion in the national media. We also can have the risk of this being the flavor of the month, creating a kind of cordon sanitaire about people who really follow this production without them creating really structural change in societies at large. So what digital media allows, without becoming naive, and keeping in mind the role of algorithmic culture, of course, surveillance, and the role of the big five, the big platforms of social media. We all know the role of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple. But we still see that there are opportunities created by the digital media for collective action, as well as for creating counter-public and organizing social movement. We all follow the Me Too, the Black Lives Matter, the Arab Spring. This is a kind of the collective social movement allowed and enabled by digital media, which on the other hand continue to be part of a kind of emotional and intimate connection through the digital diaspora that I just mentioned. So we don't have anymore the disenfranchised, but the connected migrant as Dana Di Minesco had theorized already in 2008. So just one example of the Somali diaspora that we studied in Rome, that was the project of Claudia Menchili. We realized in our culture based on orality and characterized by huge disparity within, based on religion, gender, and ethnicity, but also clanism, and a long history of conflict zone and trauma, digital media allow to contribute to rebuilding a nation, healing practices, not only through remittances and the creation of infrastructure, but also to replace immaterial network based on cultural preservation and transmission to the new generation who grew up in the diaspora and have never been to Somalia. So this collectively produced narrative about the past not only helped redefine Somali diasporic belonging through Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, public, whatever you wanted, but also operate by staking out claim to an imagined future for new generation. And I want to mention one last thing about this digital media, which is the rise of podcasting in Italy as well. Migrants are using digital media now to create new form of public, using podcasts to explore question of race and belonging. Caterina Romeo and Giulia Fabbri, in a chapter that will be forthcoming in a book that I'm editing very soon, I've analyzed this kind of growth of podcasting in Italy that actually tend to focus very much on issue of race and structural racism, which is part of a wider panorama on digital activism. So through the use of social media and other platforms, racialized subjects have fostered a collective debate on processes of racialization and creating global anti-racist network. In this digital context, podcasts present specific features that facilitate transnational dialogue and are increasingly used by Black migrant people to articulate counter-narrative on issues of race and gender oppression, migration and citizenship, generally inadequately discussed by the Italian mainstream media. So these are one of them, Sulla Razza. We also have Black Coffee and Chronicles of a Black Italian Woman. They're all trying to make a kind of interesting intervention, interviewing intellectual, bringing concept from the Afro-American context into the Italian one and trying to make this kind of translation and connection with a global landscape. So to conclude, there is a general agreement that the field of Italian postcolonial studies is belated, that there is a kind of amnesia or removal of the memory, effects and legacies of the Italian colonial past. But the contemporary pattern of immigration have suddenly requested a new awakening and the elaboration of new postcolonial consciousness vis-à-vis new political, social, cultural, and humanitarian emergencies. These are brought by the crisis in the Mediterranean, Syria, Ukraine, and many more coming on the way. So both in literary, cinematic, and digital outputs, Italian postcolonial studies have undergone a radical transition, become a very exciting and interdisciplinary field. So you really need to have a lot of different expertise in order to weave them all together. Therefore, postcolonialism, though belated and controversial, can no longer be thought of as an external or marginal to Italian studies. On the contrary, it has experienced a moment of explosion and expansion, again at a time when the postcolonial studies is in decline in other countries who prefer new fashionable terms like decolonialism, global or transnational studies, or even world literature. However, within this wider framework, there are several issues that are specific to the Italian postcolonial predicament that should be taken into account. We forget that many of the theories that are beyond the postcolonial studies are actually of Italian origin. Said was based on Gramsci, was based on Bicco, and we have contemporary theories like Agambe and Negri who still continue to influence this next generation of postcolonial thought. We have the question of the Black Mediterranean, we have the question of the double diaspora, immigration to Italy, my immigration of the past. We have many kind of race and colonial relations that are very distinctive from those in the United States of the rest of Europe. We have the relationship between North and South, the Southern question within Italy itself. They really requalify the field of Italian postcolonial studies in very specific ways. So when we have this concept traveling to Italy, we should only pay attention in the way in which they plant their seeds and the traveling theory become expanded and enlarged into new context. We also have many theorists who have been working in Italian studies in postcolonial theory from Mezzadra, Miguel Mellino, Ian Chambers, and of course the volume by Cristina Lombardi Diop, Caterina Romeo, Postcolonial Italy in 2013 have somehow solidified and consolidated the idea of the postcolonial not as a foreign imposition, but something now institutionalized and canonized within Italy itself. But most importantly, we have powerful intellectual and scholar now of color, second-generation immigrants, or simply citizens of mixed origin who have drastically changed the Italian public space, vocalizing the need to recognize and address racial issues, racial discrimination, and the need for diversity in Italian society at all levels, from the street to media culture and show business, academia, the industry, and the marketplace. So nowadays, postcolonial scholars paving the way on issue of blackness and race theory applied to Italian contexts, such as Camilla Hawthorne, Angela Pesarini, who is among us, Shailene Green, Fred Coburno has been presenting at this conference, A.C. Smith, and many others who participated in this conference, but are also very active in reshaping the field of Italian cultural studies, Italian postcolonial studies, race relationship, trying to bring it to the next level within a global connection and interconnection, but keeping in mind the very specificity of this relation within Italian landscape itself. So to conclude, my plea here is for offering new direction in Italian studies, is to make sure that this theory that travel to Italy gets reinforced by the application within specific context, allow also for the retrieval of marginalized voices that might escape the realm of mainstream media. Field work, that's why I emphasize this thing of the field work and analysis of digital practices by migrants who are not celebrities, maybe they're often invisible, like migrant women, helps to get a more layered and complex vision of the changing reality of postcolonial Italy, embracing the new opportunities and challenges offered by the changing media landscape and new global networking realities. Thank you.
Sandra, thank you so much for such a rich overview. There's a microphone. I should have mentioned before that we are streaming, and so there's a microphone. If you could please raise your and hence the microphone, the necessity. As I was saying, we are streaming. I should have mentioned that, and I apologize. Thank you for such a rich overview. And with such detail. Professor Ponzanesi has graciously agreed to discuss with us, and so there is someone who can provide who can bring you the microphone, and she will recognize you from the dais. So please just raise your hands.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this generous presentation. I was just wondering, I understand that you've worked on queer past and questions of the repression of queer identities under the fascist era, notably, and I wonder if you talk about post-colonialism as a lens, whether this could be somehow thought of in parallel with thinkers such as Gayatri Gopinath, who will think of queer optics, for instance, whether there's a space for understanding. I'm always worried about an understanding of gender as restricted to women's studies, and whether there's a space for understanding this more broadly. And I'm wondering as well about the space of activist groups such as My Queer Blackness, My Black Queerness in Italy, and what these do in your work and how you would think about these intersections. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. It's very appropriate because, of course, when you have this kind of breaking down of universalism, of unification, the question of queer theory is, of course, also an important one. It is not my topic, but I've been supervising a lot of PhDs have done work on this, and of course it is something that needs to be brought into connection also with the literature, with the cinema, but also with the social movements that are emerging in Italy, but also at European level. And of course, Gopi now has been working on this, rethinking the notion of diaspora as a way of trespassing, question of bonding and inclusion is a useful lens. I think we wanted to have her a couple of times for our summer school, but she's graciously rejected twice. But I would welcome. Now there was lockdown, otherwise she would have made it. So we had to cancel one summer school. But of course, this is our alliances and intersection that are already welcome, and each one of us, of course, as kind of specification. One of the scholars who have been working on the project, the ERC, did previously field work among queer migrants in Italy as well. And this is, of course, a much more vulnerable, invisibilized, and fragile group that needs to be taken seriously in this kind of work and approach. So thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for the very rich intervention. Speaking of the kind of the wide breadth of the talk, I was wondering whether you could take us through, allow us to take a step back and take us through the making of your archive, right? In terms of, so it is an incredibly wide archive that you've taken us through, and I think it would be helpful for us to kind of learn from you how you've put it together as this archive. So what are the criteria of selection for the cultural products that you've, what are the political criteria of selections for the cultural products that you've taken us through? Obviously you've included a lot of things, but inevitably you've excluded other things. So what comes in, what comes out, and why? And then also, I think it was quite striking, the kind of later shift onto some of the kind of conflation strategies that I think are really interesting, and that I would like you to expand on around the figuration of the migrants, and then second generations who are not migrants, right? In this archive, and that being a common pitfall, a kind of a really kind of recurrent pitfall in Italian discourses around racial formations, the fact that everyone who is not white but is Italian gets called a migrant. And so the last kind of product that you've showed us, the podcast Sulla Razza, the makers of that are second generations, and then a lot of the other products we've looked at are, some of them made by white people white Italians on the refugee crisis. So I was just wondering whether you can parse it out for us a little bit and just tell us how an archive is made, what are the fault lines, just around that, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, of course, very crucial. What you include and what you exclude is at the basis of all the kind of narrative and lineage that you try to create. I think because there was a tendency in the past to say, okay, this is our text or film made by migrants themselves, this is our books and films made about the migrants, so what you include and what you not. There is, of course, a difference in the cultural industry role. So for novels, it's much easier for migrants to be the author themselves, and cinema is a much more collective and expensive venture through which you always have this kind of compromise between the producer and the makers and the actors. But I abide by the notion of that we use in the postcolonial cinema studies, which is not the origin of the authors or the origin of the filmmaker, but the lens through which things are made. They would not exclude people having a postcolonial approach or film being postcolonial, even though it's not chronologically of the postcolonial period. For example, you can have like a postcolonial analysis of an empire film, as you can have a kind of postcolonial analysis of literature from the medieval studies, if you want to call it that way. But that being said, there is something very true in the kind of lineage this is a famous, sometimes films which were in the mainstream media, many others not made to festivals, but did not make it to wider circulation. For that reason might be lost, or they might be like part of different archives. What the selection makes in the end is the idea that you try to create a space for alternative voices to emerge, and whether that will be my task or will be just a facilitator will be open to discussion, of course. And also the question of being migrant or non-migrants is a long debate. When will migrant stop to be migrants, and when will the postcolonial end is also another issue. How long will we be postcolonial? You know, we keep going on with this question. But as long as the power relationship are not solved, I think the postcolonial as a paradigm is still very useful. And for the second generation authors, they do not qualify a migrant themselves, but sometimes the kind of political intervention, they operate through what Spivak would call identity strategic essentialism, so something that you decide to use for political and visibility gain without making it part of identity politics. Don't know whether you agree with me on that take.
Thank you, Dr. Ponzanesi, for this wonderful talk and rich overview of your work in this growing field, and for sharing your new project ahead. I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the Digital Diasporas project. It's a space I've thought a lot about in the past, looking at Somali diaspora cinema as a extra-nationally constructed phenomenon, mostly coming out of the United States. But it's also something I'm thinking about in relationship to contemporary Afro-Italian artistic production, predominantly thinking of Luigi Rigetti-Cancu's work, in which he's used the digital as a space for representation in the absence of institutional support within Italy. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the choices for your project and where you're seeing it going. Thank you.
Yeah, I think where the project is actually financially over, so what remains is, of course, this methodological approach that we developed, which was an attempt to combine the digital methods, so whatever it is online that you can actually scrape or find in a static form, but which becomes kind of meaningless unless you find the reason for the connection. So the digital traces that are behind those, it's the interesting part. And the only way you can get to those is through interviews, or by speaking with the people that being participating in the diaspora. And also the idea that diaspora are not exclusionary. You can be part of many diaspora at the same time. So what makes it like that porous, through which, for example, youth culture can be the Somali diaspora in London, at the same time the hip-hop scene, or connecting to the diaspora back home in the reconstitution of the nation. So it's very... Our approach was never to create a binary between the online and the offline, but always trying to find this constant negotiation between the two. And the idea of the ethnographic is likely to inquire what it means to users, and not the way in which this has been established through website or whatever it is regimented and formalized. On the other hand, there is a lot of surveillance going on, especially for certain communities like the Turkish one. So it is never a kind of innocent space, empowering as it seems. There are a lot of downsizes and pitfalls that we need to take into account. So I think the next stage, if I would have new funding, would be to analyze the way in which it is used for collective action, to see in which, and that will connect to the idea of the postcolonial intellectual. That's another project I'm doing, in what way actually the digital allows to create form of social movement and impact for social justice action, how that would work. But it's a different project. And maybe in that I will include not only women in the traditional sense, but all different kind of groups, as already mentioned.
Thank you so much for this exhilarating presentation. I think I'm building upon the question of where will the postcolonial end? So I currently work and do research in California where the term decolonize has become very popular, and I was moved when you brought that up in your speech. I too have a home here in Bologna. I also studied here, so it's a homecoming for me where I studied postcolonial literature as well as comparative literature. So I guess I wanted to hear what are the risks of the term and practice of decolonize. I feel that, at least in the United States, it's becoming a metaphor instead of taking it literally, which I feel is particularly dangerous in places where colonization actually has happened. So I just wanted to hear you speak to why you continue to prefer the term postcolonial as your lens.
Yeah. It's a long debate that I also have with my decolonial scholars and colleagues. And yeah, there are genealogies which are different, but there are many commonalities which we tend to forget. The two fields should not be seen as antagonists, but actually they should engage in a dialogue a little bit more. And the decolonial is, of course, now more fancy and radical, and the postcolonial scene is a bit obsolete because we still live in a colonial moment, so we will never be really postcolonial. And the colonial promises this delinking from whatever we have inherited, European culture and European knowledge. It is very tempting, but sometimes there are too many quick assumptions. Many of the debates have already been done in postcolonial studies, so it's not that novel. But what is novel maybe is the way in which it allies with activism. So it is not only that it's coming from Latin America and that has films which have not been included in postcolonial studies, but it's also easily used also for widespread practices like decolonizing the museum, decolonizing the curriculum, and it becomes a little bit opaque and whitewashed. And I know that people of indigenous origin feel very much robbed of the real decolonial struggle, because in the end, if you use it too widely, it doesn't mean anything. It becomes, like you said, a metaphor, and then it's a wonderful article. But it does not qualify the real struggle that are behind the origin of the term. And of course, many of the things like, indigenous knowledge and different religious beliefs and the way in which you want to reconnect to what are the copyrights or the principle of indigenous culture was something that also pertained to what Spivak has done with tribal groups in India. So there are many actually relations still going on. And also the question that the colonial want to disengage from European thought is always a bit problematic, because it's impossible to think in the void. There are also all debates and origin that come back to many theories, and Achille member has been debating this as well. You can have a decolonizing the university, but Fanon was there as well, and it was based on Hegel. So you cannot just cut all the threads in this kind of decolonial thinking. So I do use it, but I don't want to use it as a kind of plastic term. And there is a nice special issues now in postcolonial studies which really deal with this. The postcolonial response to decolonial thought is from our colleagues at Utrecht University. So I really stand with them in trying to make connections, but also really in being critical about the genesis and genealogies of terms, and not just using them with that facility that makes it quite useless. And the same goes for the postcolonial. It was too much encompassing. It doesn't work for that reason. Thank you. It's very hard to stand between a drink and a...
We're going to thank Sandra Ponzanesi for a very thoughtful intervention.
Thank you.
And I know we have a lot to talk about, and we can do so over a drink in Santa Cristina. And someone can help lead the way so that none of us will get lost. 8 minutes. Let us go there. Let us repair and have some celebratory conversation and a drink. Thanks so much for coming.